Welcome, everyone. Happy Tuesday. The school year is coming to a close with many of the challenges that we faced over the past, I want to say, school year and a quarter or school year and a half. We're coming to the close of one. Welcome to our last meeting of the year of SECAC, May 25th, 2021. I want to first acknowledge several people on the call. We have our SECAC board members, which includes myself as the chair, Sarah Whalen as the vice chair, Jamie Alfonso-Kumo as the secretary, and Jeannie Payne as our treasurer. We're looking to see if there's any more of our team going to be joining us, Bonnie Raza, Pam Talley, and Al Bello. And then we also have our school team partners, Ms. Trinell Bowman, who's Associate Superintendent of Special Education Services. I think we also have Mr. Edwin Saunders on from Special Education as well. We also have Karen Andrews, who is our Coordinating Supervisor for Special Education Department. We have Marcy Tershon on, who's the Program Coordinator for Family Engagement. And also Yvette Young, who is now our host, who is also with the Family Engagement Center. And I'm not sure if Dr. Beth Deontay is on. I don't see her. And then we also, for a moment, had board member Pamela Booz Struthers. Oh, there she is. Boozer Struthers. She's on board as well. And so I want to welcome everyone, our school partners, our board members. If any of the school partners that have not been mentioned, I'm not recognizing your name, but also welcome our parents to our last meeting of the year. Again, my name is Troy Sampson. I'm the chair of SECAC, and we have a packed agenda tonight. We're going to get an update from the Special Education Department, and then we're going to have a presentation on disproportionality and equity and suspension and expulsions, get the current data and also strategic plan. We're also going to have a presentation. Hopefully, Mr. Showalter will join us on mental health awareness, and then we'll have public comment and questions, and then we'll have elections, because it's that time. I've come to the end of my term as chair, and I don't have a problem continuing on in that role, but we're going to open the floor for elections as well for our board members, the seats of chair, vice chair, treasurer, and secretary. But without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Trinell Bowman for update from Special Education Department.
Good evening, everyone. Again, we are just about at the end of our school year. The main update that I just want to share is that our teams continue to hold data review meetings, as well as our compensatory education and recovery services impact meetings. On Friday, we will be training all of our elementary special education coordinators, as well as special education chairs. They were the last group to train this school year, and they will be trained on Friday. We've trained roughly 700 different administrators, teachers, principals across our district, as well as supporting our non-public partners through this process. So again, like I think I shared with you a few months ago, we know that this is going to be a long journey to get all of our meetings done, but I did want to let you know that we have leveraged some federal funding to be able to support not only providing the compensatory recovery services for our students, but also supporting our teams this summer with holding those meetings based on the data that they have reviewed. And again, I just want to reiterate to families to let you know that our teachers have worked tirelessly this school year. They are 10-month employees, so it is on a volunteer basis for those staff members who are 10 months who choose to work this summer. But I do know that we have a resilient group of educators that are committed to ensuring that we continue to meet IDEA requirements, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And last summer, we actually held over 1,800 IEP meetings. So our team stands committed to continue to work through those processes. We also are continuing this summer with our reevaluations, as well as any initial evaluations that we have to do for our assessments. We are still backlogged, but we do have kind of this three-pronged approach with face-to-face assessments, virtual assessments, both for presence learning, our contracted vendor, as well as our school psychologists and related services who will continue to do those virtual assessments. So I did want to let families know that we are continuing, again, those assessments this summer. And we hope that with those three-pronged approaches that we're taking, that we hopefully in the next 6 months will be caught up on all of our assessments. So we continue to monitor that weekly. So those are the two main updates that I wanted to share with everyone. The last update that I'll share is we are phasing out our last three programs for our comprehensive special education program. So, you know, we started this journey, for those of you who've been around, in 2017. We started the journey to phase out our comprehensive special education programs throughout the district. We have 11 sites that were left at the elementary level. And this year coming up, we will be phasing out those last three program sites, which is Francis Scott Key, Judge Savannah Woods, as well as Gaywood Elementary. And the way that we're phasing out those programs is not phasing out the students that are existing in the programs, but we're just not sending students to the programs beginning in kindergarten. So they then will go to their neighborhood school. And I do know that the data that we've looked at over several years shows that our students have made progress and continue to maintain progress based on our training plan and the supports that we provide to our neighborhood schools. So I did want to share that last update, and that would be it for updates from me.
All right, thank you, Chanel, for that update. And so we're gonna roll right into our next topic and presentation, which is disproportionality and equity and suspension and expulsions. That includes the current data and also PGCPS's strategic plan. And that's gonna include, again, Ms. Bowman, and also the Associate Supervisor of the Department of Special Education, Edwin Saunders.
So thanks so much, Karen. She's gonna click for us today. So I do want to acknowledge that when we think about disproportionality and equity in our suspensions and expulsions, that we know that this has definitely been a priority, not only of Dr. Goldson's, but our Board of Education members that continue to look at ways that we can provide equitable access for all students, including students with disabilities. I also wanted to share that we're in the process of updating our Prince George's County Public Schools strategic plan, and that plan is really based on the equity lens. We also have spent the year looking at illicit bias and equity. The Division of Academics, in which special education is now a part of, has spent an entire year. We actually have our 5th meeting this week, really looking at culturally responsive teaching. That also includes thinking about the equity as we develop our curriculum, as we select materials, as we think about our different student groups. So Dr. White, our Chief Academic Officer, has taken us through this journey with a work group that really has allowed us to unpack the discussion and have courageous conversations around equity. And you'll notice that as the Prince George's County Public Schools strategic plan is updated and released, that you'll see that there is definitely a focus on equity and a focus on social emotional wellness and learning for our students. On the next slide, I just want to acknowledge our Board of Education members. And again, thank them for their leadership and their stewardship as it relates to the equity lens and the equity conversation. On the next slides, I just wanted to bring this slide back and just share this with you, that back in January 11, 2019, Dr. Goldson had released an article in the Washington Post. And one of the things that she really focused on in this article is really rethinking our discipline policies. So I wanted to take us a few years back in order to come forward, because one of the things that Dr. Goldson was definitely committed to is that we had to strike a balance between love and discipline and guiding principles, and really build those home and parent partnerships that not only resonate in the classroom, but after our students leave. And that we have to make the right decisions for our students and really think about the culture in which our students operate. And that starts not only with us as leaders, but our community, our parents, our students, and all of the staff that support us. So there is a link once the PowerPoint is released to you and uploaded. There is a link where you can actually read that article in fullness. And that really, I think, started this equity look at how we view discipline in our school district. On the next slide, I just wanted to share that when we think about disproportionality, under the special education department, we really look at it from the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And so the way that they define disproportionality is really looking at the disproportionate representation, either of the over or underrepresentation of a particular population. This population could be defined by racial, ethnic, social and economic status, national origin, English language proficiency, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or specific population category. So for us under IDEA in Maryland, one of the places that we are represented disproportionate is around the suspension of African-American students compared to non-disabled peers. I would like you to know that for Maryland State Department of Education, as it relates to IDEA and the way that disproportionality is defined here, is that you're considered at risk if your disproportionate percentage exceeds 2.0. So we know that our district back in 2017-18 did have a risk ratio of 4.0. And then as we transition to the next slide, you'll be able to see where we are as a district in terms of our data. So again, the Individuals with Disability Education Act does classify districts in need of comprehensive coordinated early intervening services as a result of disproportionality. There's 96 different ways that we could be disproportionate. So there's 96 different factors or categories, because remember, it's every race, it's every ethnic group, it's disability. And so in Prince George's County right now, we are disproportionate for our suspension. This means that 15% of the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or Part B funds, must be devoted to developing a restricted grant to provide coordinated early intervening services to our students. We're happy to report that CCEIS now supports general and special education students. When we think about our disproportionality results in Prince George's County, again, we are disproportionate for African-American students with disabilities being suspended for 10 or less days. We do believe that we have made remarkable progress, because 4 years ago, we were at 4.26% of our students being disproportionate for more than 10 days. So we've gotten that factor under control. And we currently have only one school that actually is in that category, as opposed to several dozen that was in that category 4 years ago. And so currently we are disproportionate for students being suspended, African-American students with disabilities, for 10 or less days, and we're at 2.78%. So again, if you look at where we were 4 years ago, we are making progress. And I'm going to kind of walk you through some of those pieces in which we have done as a district to really be proactive to support this process.
Hey, Chanel, I have a question.
Yes.
So where are we on, I know we're at 2.78 for 10 days or less, right? What does that number for 10 days or more look like? Because the 10 days or more is saying that there were 4.26 for 10 days or more. What does that 10 days or more number look like now?
So Mr. Saunders is he probably has the data to tell you that we are under 2% for the 10 or more days, but we'll pull that data up and make sure by the end of the presentation, we can put that in the chat and give you that updated number. But we are under the 2% threshold for that. But we'll look it up and give that to you. I don't know, Mr. Saunders, if you have it yet.
And actually, I am looking at it. For 2020, for African American, we're at 3.45, for greater than 10 days.
But I think that's reasonable. The reasonable progress takes us under 2.0.
So we were able to make reasonable progress of 0.91. So we reduced our risk ratio from 4.36 to 3.45.
Which means
out of school suspension.
So it's reasonable progress, but we're no longer disproportionate under the guidelines of the state for that category.
Correct, yep.
Any other questions before we move on? So we want to go through now and just talk about the approaches that we've used to address disproportionate suspensions. And on the next couple of slides, one of the big things that Dr. Golson really worked with our student services department on is to really look at our response levels as it related to our discipline and how we suspended students. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the old response level. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the new response level related to different categories. I think it's important to note that in our old response level, as it related to discipline, there were certain categories in which students could be suspended for. For example, in the old response level, some students could have been suspended for disruption. However, in the new response level, students are no longer able to be suspended for disruption at the level 3. You'll see that level 3 under disruption, for example, was removed in the new response level, which means students can no longer be suspended for out of school suspension for disruption as an example. You'll also notice disruption of property is another example. So in the old response level for students in pre-K to 5th grade, you'll see levels 1, 2, and 3. Level 3 is where suspension could be imposed outside of the school. And you'll notice that the new response level, both for pre-K to 5th grade as well as 6th to 12th grade, only has disruption of property below 500 at levels 1, 2, and 3. So those are just some of the examples. Disrespect was another one that impacted all of our grades, where again, level 3 was removed and only at level 1, 2 for the new response level. So we do know, based on the change of level of when you can suspend, that definitely will impact and has impacted our suspension. We did not, of course, have a full year of the new discipline responses because of COVID. And of course, this year we, up until we returned for the school year, we actually only had, at that moment, I believe 14 to 15 students even suspended throughout the school year. So again, these the new levels went into effect during the 1920 school year. And then on the next slide is some additional.
Before you go on, I'm sorry, Sarah's had her hand up and I'm thinking she may have a question.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't
you.
see the presentation. Go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself here. I actually, you had asked if we had questions and I just wasn't fast enough on raising my hand for the previous section. I wanted to ask about the 15% of IDEA Part B funds that you mentioned. And I was really excited to hear that you can now use that for special education students, because that didn't used to be true. I'm curious what percentage are being used for special education students right now?
So Mr. Saunders is going to get into that a little bit further, but basically we do support on our, when we look at our crisis intervention resource teachers in terms of their caseload, it is 50-50. So in our district, we do require our certs to support our students with the social emotional curriculum. And in some other strategies, they have to be at a 50% ratio. So we want to make sure that we're supporting, we can't exceed the 50%. So we couldn't have 55% of our students for special ed being supported and only 45%. But we do know that for CCEIS, it is a systemic approach. So in some cases, some of the strategies that we're using is really for all students. So it's for general ed and special ed. For example, when Mr. Saunders goes over some of the restorative approaches that we're doing in our district, some of those responses and interventions are for all students. So both general ed and special ed. But in terms of specific caseloads for our crisis intervention resource teachers, they do maintain a 50-50 caseload, 50% special ed, 50% general ed.
Okay, and one more question. In terms of dollars, if we were not disproportionate, how much more would special education be getting for its students?
So we had our actual grant webinar today, so I don't have the figure in terms of what our restricted amount will be for next year, but for this past school year, it was 4.1 million was restricted.
Okay.
For CCEIS.
Thanks.
Okay.
So again, on the other slide, you can see Again, looking at the possession of illegal drugs, paraphernalia, et cetera, the level in the old response, and then the updated response. Also looking at false alarm, that was another area in which students could be suspended. And this is out of school suspension. Once you get to level 3, you will see that that was taken down to a level 2, which means students cannot be suspended outside of the school for that particular offense. The same thing with gambling. You see that in the old response level, there was a level 3, and the new response is a level 2. And then you can see the other examples. So really trying to, again, as Dr. Golson put it, strike the balance between love and discipline, but also making sure that we're not using our code of conduct to have students leave our schools, but that we really are thinking about the interventions that we're giving students to support them in these particular areas. And I think the other big piece that we've really pushed and that we will be pushing as part of our updated CCEIS plan is the recalibration and the relook of those tiered interventions around behavior and social emotional support to our students. So what are those tier 1 universal interventions that schools will have access to, that they should be using for general ed and special ed students? What does tier 2 behavior interventions look like? And then what are those tier 3 supports and what do they look like? And I think that definitely when school teams recognize and understand the different interventions that can support students at the different levels, I think that definitely will help in terms of providing support to our students, because we don't want them leaving our schools. We want them to be in school, learning and growing, but we also know that for some students, we do have to provide interventions. And then we want to make sure that, of course, we're monitoring those interventions. And we do provide not only students with disabilities, but behavior intervention plans, but we also provide general education students with behavior intervention plans. I want to make sure people recognize that as well. Sometimes people think only special ed students could have a behavior intervention plan, but we also have students in general education that also may have a behavior intervention plan. So that's one of our plan action steps that we'll be taking this year in our upgraded CCEIS plan, again, to look systemically, not just about special ed, but about all of our students. And that's what CCEIS funding is really about. And it's a systemic approach across the district. So that's an example of an activity that we will be doing and kind of bringing back, recalibrating school teams on understanding what's available and what they can access around those different levels.
Hey, Chanel, I have a question.
Yes.
So if we're looking at disproportionality from both special education students and general education students, right? And we're disproportionate, how much of the funding is coming? Is all the funding that is being restricted, the 4.1 million, is all that just coming from special education, or is Correct. That also, okay, so my question to that is, if we are lumping all of our students together, why does special education have to take the hit?
So that when IDEA was reauthorized, that was part of what was reauthorized in the legislation around disproportionality. So that was, of course, a leverage at the congressional level by Congress when IDEA was reauthorized back in 2004 to really look at disproportionality. So unfortunately for us, that was something that came at the federal level in terms of the update to IDEA. I think the other big factor around IDEA, around disproportionality, is that we're really looking at a systemic approach, but also making sure that we're focusing in on students. And I think that's one of the remarkable pieces around IDEA being, or around the additional guidance around disproportionality, that now we can also focus on students with disabilities and what their needs may be. But I think it's still from a congressional view to look at a holistic view of disproportionality through the lens of a systemic approach. But that's something that, you know, we've wrestled with a long time. So just think about up until a year ago, we couldn't even use this funding on special education students specifically to target interventions specifically for them as individual students. Now, systemically, we could do things that may have looked and supported all students, but in terms of really working individually with students, that was definitely not acceptable, but that has changed. So we're hoping that as more of our lobbyists, educational lobbyists, really tackles disproportionality, that we can begin to look at that differently. And perhaps it will be pushed out of IDEA in terms of the funding component. Now, we do have the state disproportionality component that looks at disproportionate under COMAR, so the Code of Maryland regulations. That's a separate conversation, and we have about 19 targeted schools in Prince George's County that's under the state guidance, but that's a whole different criteria in which we look at, and there is no funding that comes from the state to really focus on those particular schools that are disproportionate under the state regulations.
Yeah, it just seems
a little unequitable.
Yeah, it just seems, I'm gonna just be straight with it, unfair as heck that the entire population, the entire student population is being counted as disproportionate, but because we're disproportionately out of balance, the money is coming from the students' budget that need it the most. That $4.1 million could go a long way for our special education students. And we want to talk about equity. That is definitely inequitable as you can get.
Right. And I think one of the things that we've worked hard in the Department of Special Ed is we work collaboratively with our area office, student services. And one of the things that we've tried to, as we think about our CCEIS plan and our systemic approach, is we've tried to think about it in such a way that if the funding was not restricted, is the response and things that we're doing something that we would do, right? And so really ramping up the social emotional. One of the other pieces that we'll be adding to our CCEIS plan is to really look at, again, the monitoring of our FBA, functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. We know that in Prince George's County, that is an area of weakness for us. And when I say weakness, I'm talking about the development of our plans for students, the monitoring of our plans, and the target interventions. So that's something that we know, whether we had restricted funding or not, we really should be focusing on it. We've monitored, we've done self-assessments. We know kind of where those pressure points are for us that we need to improve on. So for example, if we had CCEIS funding restricted or not, we know we have to focus on both the development of FBAs, functional behavior assessments, the implementation of those. And we have over 1,500 kids with disabilities that have those plans. And so one of the things that we're doing, again, as another upgrade to the plan action, is to have a monitoring process to monitor our BIPs, to also train our school teams. The great thing is, we, at the end of this year, we would have brought on 2 certified behavior analysts to really help us unpack what that training should look like. We know that Maryland State Department of Education is also rolling out a new behavior intervention plan template. So there's going to be a great opportunity for us to do training and to recalibrate and to monitor those plans. But that would be something that we would do whether we had the restricted funding or not. So we really are trying to leverage the CCEIS funding in a way that helps us to support our students with disabilities in a way that we may not have done that before, so that once we're no longer restricted, there is a course of action and a plan that helps support the implementation of our IEPs, if that makes sense. And so we've tried to really look at it, how we can leverage this funding to support the implementation of our IEPs and support our students in a way that the law is intended to, as an example. So that's one thing that we really, really have focused on.
Now, Sarah has another, you got it, Yvette. Sarah has another question. Her hand is
okay.
Up. Yeah.
Hey there. Just a question about do you know whether other districts around the state are disproportionate? Because we've been disproportionate for a very, very long time. And I'm just curious how that compares to other districts.
Yeah, so there are districts that are disproportionate. I can actually get that data in terms of how many districts are in each category. So I know that Marcella Frankowski, our Assistant State Superintendent for the Division of Early Intervention and Special Ed Services, does have that data in terms of how many districts fall into the different categories. I explained it earlier that we have about 96 different categories, but I can definitely get the number of districts that are disproportionate for suspension. And remember, for suspension, you can be disproportionate in 4 different categories. So that's in-school suspension for less than 10 days, in-school suspension for more than 10 days, out-of-school suspension for 10 or more days, and then out-of-school suspension for 10 or less days. But I can definitely follow up with the Maryland State Department of Education and get that specific data, just so that you know how we look, how we align to other districts.
And I'd also love, I don't know if they have this, but I'd love to know how long they've been out of compliance, in addition to how, you know, which ones.
So I can tell you that Prince George's County Public Schools and Baltimore City have been in disproportionate status at least 10 years. So I can share that. I do know that in terms of the length, that Baltimore City and Prince George's are the longest standing districts that have been in CCEIS status, the longest.
Thanks.
All right, well, what I'm going to do now is turn the presentation over to Mr. Saunders, who's going to give you an overview of some of the restorative approaches and interventions that we're using with our CCEIS funds and supports to our schools.
And Trinell, unfortunately, that was kind of a downer when you mentioned that it's been 10 years. But I guess Ms. Whalen and the rest of the, first of all, good evening, everyone. I'm Edwin Saunders, as Trinell introduced me earlier. It is incredibly frustrating when we take a look at the fact that we continue to be disproportionate in the area of disciplinary removals, while we have also made significant progress in reducing suspensions throughout our district, level 1 and level 2 suspensions, to include disruption, disrespect, dress code violations and the like, as well as some more impactful suspensions or more egregious suspensions. We've been able to reduce those significantly. I believe Trinell shared that Ben Levenger, who is with the Research Data and Accountability Office, actually was able to support us in identifying schools for the upcoming year based on suspension data during the 1920 school year. And what we noticed was a significant number of our schools had very low percentages of suspensions for both students with disabilities and students in the general ed population. So it does kind of remain still a mystery why we are kind of wrestling with something that the district has developed a very comprehensive plan to address. And I think from its inception, when Trinell and Dr. Mason really kind of envisioned what comprehensive coordinated early intervening services would look like, it really served as kind of a prototype that could be used to address the needs of both students with disabilities and students in the general ed population, particularly looking at tiering support, as Trinell mentioned earlier, where you've got your universal supports through restorative practices or restorative approaches, to include your SEL curriculum, social emotional learning curriculum, in addition to the overlay of your crisis intervention resource teachers and mental health providers to provide direct support to students with more challenging behaviors. But if you take a look out at the revisions that were made to the Code of Conduct, or the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, the Code of Conduct portion of it, restorative approaches is addressed at every response level. And the intent there is really to build that relationship, that sense of community within classrooms and within a school that ultimately impacts both climate and culture, that causes students to think twice about committing harm. And when harm is committed, then there is some deliberate way at repairing that harm. We are very pleased to share with you that the CCIS funds have been used to train restorative practice trainers that would not only support the 38 targeted CCIS schools, but schools throughout the district as we continue to roll out restorative approaches or restorative practices throughout the district. And as you know, under the umbrella of restorative approaches, we're looking at peer mediation, we're looking at circles, we're looking at restorative chats. Social and emotional learning curriculum also is a restorative approach, behavior contracts, all of those fall under the umbrella of restorative approaches. The next slide. So with our CCIS plan, we were very deliberate in saying that at the 38 schools, we really want to be very explicit in teaching social emotional learning to a targeted group of students. And as Trinell shared, both students with disabilities and students in the general ed population. Unfortunately, 4 years ago, for at least 2 of those past 4 years, we were only allowed to directly support students in the general ed population. Over the last 2 years, we've been able to support students with disabilities as well. So we've got our students with disabilities and general ed students who are receiving access to the Rethink curriculum. We've got a number of our crisis teachers who are not just teaching students on their caseloads, but they're pushing into classrooms from 15 to 30 minutes a day, teaching social emotional lessons, lessons that teach students how to identify their triggers, how to make responsible decisions, how to engage in more productive and positive conversations with their peers, how to respond to correction from the teachers, skills that we just assume students come to school with. We have some students who don't come to school with those skills, so who definitely benefit from some very deliberate and intentional instruction in that area. At our 38 targeted CCIS schools, we've got crisis intervention resource teachers, social workers, and psychologists to provide, as Trinell said earlier, that tiered support to students with challenging behaviors, but to also directly impact culture and climate at the schools. I also definitely want to point out that while the plan targets 38 schools, we've got a number of individuals within our department who provide support to all of the schools in the district. So whether it's supporting schools in building robust problem-solving teams, such as student intervention teams or kid talk teams, whether it's supporting schools in accessing and using their sponsor intervention online tracking tool, whether it's supporting school teams in developing data collection systems to inform the development of NFBA and BIP, whether it is supporting school teams in just basic classroom management. We've got individuals within our office that have provided a myriad of professional learning opportunities to schools throughout the district that, again, directly impact students with disabilities as well as students in the general ed population. Also within this plan, the last bullet point, within this plan, we've got people personnel workers. So to Trinell's point, there's a lot of collaboration between the Department of Special Education and the Department of Student Services. So this last bullet point speaks to that collaboration. Our people personnel workers who are a part of student services collaborate with CEIS folk as well as school-based individuals, school-based leaders and school-based staff to take a look at suspension data. And very proud to point out that not so much an issue during the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, those meetings were conducted on a monthly basis where that data was analyzed and students were identified, both students with disabilities and students in the general ed population, for direct support through a crisis teacher or a mental health provider. Next slide, please. This slide just kind of speaks to the outline of our social emotional learning curriculum, Rethink. It's based on CASEL, the collaborative, the academic, social, and emotional learning. It's 5 core competencies: self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness.
And sorry, Edwin, I was just gonna add for families, so to let you know that there is a family community component to the Rethink curriculum, in which parents, our search do send home strategies and newsletters and ideas of how parents could reinforce some of the strategies that students have learned in school. So there's definitely that family school connection with the Rethink curriculum that I think it's definitely helpful for families as they're navigating with their son and daughters, particularly around those areas that may be impacting them, not only in school, but also at home.
And I know you've heard before, we've got a lot of the work really hinges on our crisis intervention resource teachers. We've got really 25 at this point, 25, 26, that directly support a caseload of students. They start the year with 30 students, as Trinell shared, both general ed and special ed students. And we really asked them to grow that caseload based on a review of monthly suspension data, referrals from school teams, referrals from administrators. We've even, in some cases, had referrals from parents to add to our crisis teachers' caseload. Crisis teachers, they conduct check-in, check-out as a way to support students with goal setting, as a way to reinforce strategies that are taught during Rethink lessons. Those crisis intervention resource teachers also serve as a very important resource for school teams in really identifying de-escalation strategies, modeling de-escalation strategies, encouraging school teams to participate in Nonviolent Crisis Prevention Institute trainings, classroom management trainings. They also play, the crisis teachers, a very important role in those disproportionate suspension meetings. And yet another collaboration with student services. They also support the work of positive behavior intervention and supports at their respective schools to ensure that there is common language and a common way of addressing infractions, teaching rules, routines, procedures at the school. So it is a very comprehensive plan, and to the earlier point, we have seen really good progress in the reduction of the risk ratio that just seems to be incredibly challenging, really getting that risk ratio below 2.0. But there is a lot of evidence to support that the district has made tremendous progress in reducing the suspensions of students with disabilities. When you take a look at percentages for individual schools, and when you look at just raw numbers, that risk ratio, I wish I were a truth mathematician, I probably could explain it in much greater detail and explain why it continues to be an area of concern. But I think that we do have more than enough data to support that the plan, and probably most importantly, the change in mindset at the building level has resulted in a significant reduction in suspensions.
Question.
Yes, sir.
In terms of suspensions and expulsions, what do the numbers, or do you guys have the numbers on the two different populations? What the number is for the general population students and what the number is for the special education population of students? And the reason why I asked that question is, would it be wise for us to maybe center more resources or assert resources to special education? Or is that, or would that make a difference because the numbers are lumped together in terms of us being at that ratio? Because, and the reason why I say is because we got a lot of money coming out of special education, you know, for being disproportionate. And I'm thinking if the numbers are higher on the special education side, would it be wise for us to, or I think it, no, I would say, would it be, it would be wise for us to dedicate more resources on the CERT side to that special education population to further bring that number down, if I'm making sense.
You are, I don't see Chanel's face, so I can't get a nonverbal. Okay. So
yeah, go ahead, Edwin.
What's been interesting, Mr. Sampson, and this actually was just shared with us through ongoing conversations with research data and accountability. So when the state takes a look at disproportionality, particularly in the area of disciplinary removals, we thought for the longest time that the comparison was between general ed and special ed students. But it appears the state is looking at comparisons among racial groups within that disability category. So we are disproportionate for 10 or fewer days for African-American students with disabilities. So the state is looking at the rate at which we suspend African-American students compared to the rate at which we suspend, African-American students with disabilities compared to the rate at which we suspend non-African-American students with disabilities, which is quite interesting in kind of determining a risk ratio. So not only then, to your point, Mr. Sampson, what we probably want to look at, okay, so, you know, how do the suspensions of, how do suspensions of students with disabilities compare to suspensions of students in the general ed population, but then look at each race category as we've done with students with disabilities and really kind of see, do we see significant disparity or disproportionality rather in those categories, in those racial groups. Hopefully I explained that correctly, Trinell.
Nope, you're right on target. And I would just add that, you know, when we looked at every single school in our district, we had some schools that were disproportionate, but they might have only suspended one student with a disability all year and been over the 2.0% ratio, because that student might have had multiple suspensions in a given year, but it might have only been one African-American student with a disability. So one of the things that our accountability folks really pushed and said to us is that in some cases we have to be cautious, because you could have a few schools pulling our data up, but when you actually drill down to how many African-American students with disabilities were suspended as opposed to non-African-American or African-American students without disability, it's almost like there was only one student there or only two students there. So now you're drilling down deeper to see, well, what exactly was going on with that one student? And that's part of when we did our self-reflection and our survey and looking at the individual needs of our students. One of the big things and ahas that we walked away with, and we had psychologists, student service representatives, special ed representatives, including myself, I did record reviews as well, is it kept coming back to the response to intervention. Our response to intervention. Like we had the student has been suspended multiple times, but what we were not seeing is a response to the intervention for that student with fidelity. So when we looked at our, response to intervention tracking tool, we noticed that this was highlighted for the student, but we didn't see where teams actually came back. They said they were going to do certain things. That sounded really good. But as we did our record reviews and we came back to try to drill down to, they said they were going to do this, where did we see the evidence of them doing it? It was missing. And so that's why we really, really want to focus on, as part of our updated plan, to really tease out that the response to intervention around those three different tiers of support and really recalibrate that back with school teams, and also the monitoring of our functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. We think by definitely leveraging those two action steps will definitely give, I think, meaning to school teams and be reflective. And again, we're not coming in to say you did something wrong, but I think it's important to be reflective and to really show what our data shows as a district, that yes, we're bringing kids into the student instructional team to sit meetings. We're talking about students. We're coming up with great interventions, but then the monitoring of it, the implementation of it, and then Johnny is getting suspended for the same offense from 2 months ago, but yet the intervention was never put in place and monitored for fidelity. So that's what we saw when we did, our record review. And we also had the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education come in and Maryland State Department of Education. We did a whole self-assessment on ourselves. And that was some of the things that we noticed in reviewing our student records, both general ed and special ed students. So we know that that's an area that we have to focus on, which is that response to intervention and monitoring those intervention strategies.